Your fingernail has experienced that small betrayal, the moment when one scrape feels more convincing than every decision not to scratch. You hesitate, press down. Then the first rough line crosses the itch, and for a brief moment, the signal loosens. It feels right. That is the first trap. This is not just weak discipline or a childish habit hiding beneath adult skin. The fingernail is an ancient removal tool, responding to a signal from a border alarm. Acute itch, clinically known as protective pruritus, once warned the skin about arthropods, parasites, plant irritants, and removable contaminants. Simply put, the skin acted as a checkpoint, and crawling, biting, stinging things were problems solved by friction. But hold that feeling for a second. The relief is not some accidental afterthought. The scrape feels like progress because the ancient command expects a removable enemy. If something clings, rub it off. If something bites, tear it away. If something stings, interrupt the invasion before it spreads. Now, the contradiction becomes clear. Modern itch doesn't always come with a flea, a thorn, or any visible irritant. Sometimes the alarm sounds with nothing the nail can actually remove, yet the command still reaches your fingertip. The disturbing truth is that relief may be the body's way of telling you to keep damaging the surface. The easy explanation is almost comforting. People scratch because discipline failed. They scratch because pain has become oddly pleasurable. They scratch because a small irritation is exaggerated beyond what it is. That explanation feels tidy because it frames this reflexive action as a character flaw. It gives someone to blame. But the skin doesn't operate on etiquette. Pain and itch are separate but interacting sensory systems. Simply put, they are different warning signals that meet close enough to interfere with each other. When your fingernail scrapes the surface, it adds mild pain and competing input to the spinal cord. For a short time, that louder input can suppress the itch. So the relief is real. But that is the trap. The metaphor isn't healing, it's interference. A louder signal briefly drowns out a smaller alarm without fixing the broken wire beneath. The quiet after the scrape doesn't prove the danger is gone. It only shows the nervous system has been forced to focus on something sharper. That's why scratching can feel right internally, even as the skin begins to redden. Scratching doesn't have to solve the original problem. It only has to interrupt it. And the darker possibility is this. The very scrape that quiets the alarm can become the first step to making it louder. The older mistake was to think of itch as pain turned down low, as if the nervous system had just one dial and one wire. Pain up top, itch somewhere lower, a smaller complaint from the same machinery. Now, let's slow things down a bit. In 2007, at Washington University School of Medicine, Jiufeng Chen and colleagues published a study in Nature showing that mice lacking gastrin-releasing peptide receptor signaling, in simple terms, this means there are relay cells in the spinal cord dedicated to carrying the message of itch. It's not a faint echo or a weak pain signal. It's a specific alarm line running through the spinal cord, distinct from the pain pathway. The clinical term for itch is pruritus. That word sounds sterile, almost detached, but it describes a sensation powerful enough to take control of your hand before you consciously decide to act. It's the difference between hearing a vague noise outside and suddenly hearing a clear alarm ringing right beside your ear. This explains why telling someone to just stop scratching misses the point neurologically. It assumes the conscious mind is present from the start, calmly weighing restraint against harm. But the spinal cord doesn't wait for a thoughtful debate. By the time you consciously consider holding back, the message has already traveled through the lower nervous system, and your fingernail is already seen as the tool for the job. Here comes the first cold truth. Scratching is not just a misguided response to a minor irritation. It's an action selected by an older system that expects a removable problem on the skin, something crawling, biting, or clinging. When this ancient command meets a modern itch without a clear target to remove, the command doesn't simply fade. Instead, it can become even more confusing because the signal is real, yet the source is missing. So, the shame often associated with scratching usually misunderstands how the system works. A person may know their skin will suffer, or even regret the mark before it appears. But conscious knowledge and spinal signaling don't operate with the same timing or intensity. If itch has its own dedicated wiring, then the urge it produces isn't just a decorative feeling. It's a direct instruction, arriving with authority. We've seen that itch is not just a weaker pain signal. It travels along its own path through the spinal cord. But this still leaves a tougher question. Why does scratching not only relieve discomfort, but also feel like the right thing to do? And this is where the story becomes more unsettling. In 2008, researchers at Wake Forest University used functional MRI to observe what happens during scratching. Functional MRI, or fMRI, tracks changes in brain activity in real time as a person experiences something. Instead of asking someone to describe relief afterward, it watches the brain's response while relief is being produced. The findings showed more than just that scratching made the itch feel better. Scratching could suppress activity in brain regions linked to unpleasant sensations and emotions, while activating reward and motivation circuits. In other words, the brain wasn't just reducing the unpleasantness, it was signaling that the action was something worth repeating. That difference is important. Relief is passive. It means the unpleasant feeling has faded. Motivation is active. It means keep doing that. So the ancient removal routine doesn't need to confirm that a parasite is gone. It just needs enough friction, pressure, and sensory change to convince the brain that the hand is doing something useful. It's like a damaged checkpoint printer stamping progress on an action that's actually wearing down the border. It doesn't pause to check what the skin looks like tomorrow, or inspect blood, swelling, or raw patches. The routine was built for a surface enemy, something that could be scraped away. When the signal comes from chronic itch, the same routine can keep rewarding behaviors that cause damage. In 2011, fMRI studies on atopic dermatitis found that patients showed stronger reward responses to scratching compared with healthy controls. Atopic dermatitis is a chronic itch, not just a fleeting irritation. Put simply, the scratched skin isn't just sending a single complaint, it trains the reward system to treat scratching as more helpful than it really is. That's why someone caught in this behavior can experience two things at once. One part of them knows scratching is making the surface worse, and another part feels relief, progress, and correction. This is not a moral failing. It's a nervous system rewarding an ancient removal algorithm in the wrong context. The body can make a harmful action feel not just relieving, but somehow the right thing to do. Once scratching becomes rewarding, the question shifts. It's no longer only why the hand moves, but what happens when the command finds no flea, no mite, no thorn, no visible cause, but still refuses to stop. Chronic pruritus means itch lasting more than 6 weeks. This is not a brief irritation. It's an alarm that's been active long enough to intrude on daily life. The old parasite removal command now finds itself trapped inside a modern structure where the intruder is the wiring, the walls, and the alarm system itself. Atopic dermatitis is one version of that building. Phlegon-related barrier dysfunction can weaken the skin's outer seal. In other words, the wall isn't holding tight. This leads to transepidermal water loss. Water escapes through the compromised surface. The seal leaks, the skin dries out, and the very leak it causes helps to fuel the alarm. Then inflammatory mediators enter the cycle. This means chemical signals that push irritation, sensitivity, and itch through the tissue. Translated simply, the damaged barrier starts sending messages even when nothing is touching it. The hand comes down as if removing an invader, but the scratching can act like a file, further damaging the cracked seal. So, no, just because there's no visible enemy doesn't mean the alarm is false. Another reason the usual explanation falls short is non-histaminergic itch. This means the itch signal isn't primarily traveling the allergy pathway. In everyday terms, that's why antihistamines often fail, even though the itch is very real. The message might instead be carried by cytokines, neuropeptides, or opioid pathways, side streets rather than the main road that usual blockers target. Kappa opioid targets are important because opioid pathways influence how itch is generated and controlled. For context, the same broad systems that alter pain and reward responses also affect the itch signal. The surface is no longer the only suspect. The signal can be routed through deeper biological traffic. Nocturnal pruritus adds a colder edge to this mismatch. This term means itch that worsens at night. Changes in skin temperature, circadian shifts in barrier function, and fewer distractions mean the chemistry grows louder in the quiet of the night. Stress-linked neuroimmune amplification adds another layer. This means nervous and immune signals intensify each other under stress. Put bluntly, stress doesn't create itch from scratch. It turns up the volume on a signal already running beneath the surface. This is why chronic eczema, nighttime itch, antihistamine failure, systemic itch, opioid-related itch, and stress itch all exist together in the same grim frame. They aren't identical, nor do they need to be. But they share one dangerous mismatch: A removal command keeps firing, yet what it attacks can't be removed by nails. This command was designed for outside invaders. Today, the intruder might be the barrier, chemistry, signaling pathways, or the sensitized alarm itself. The most frustrating part is that it looks irrational only because the real trigger hides beneath the surface. Fake. And now the loop closes. The itch-scratch cycle is not just a metaphor for poor discipline. It is a physical sequence. Itch triggers scratching. Scratching breaks the skin's barrier. This damage increases inflammation. Immune and nerve signals intensify the itch, and the stronger itch restarts the whole process. Simply put, the skin becomes a cracked seal, and the nail turns into sandpaper. The body keeps scraping because the alarm insists the irritant is still there. This is the system's final cruelty. Scratching can feel like progress because the nervous system marks the movement as useful. But the involvement of reward pathways doesn't mean simple pleasure. It means the brain has tagged this act with a cold internal message. Keep going. This explains why the action can override reason. The conscious mind says stop, yet the older reflex perceives friction, pain, and brief relief as proof the tool is working. Now, the tool itself has become part of the injury. The command center is unaware. This is the defense system we've been tracing. One that hands the body a tool even after it has become part of the damage. It once worked well against things clinging to the surface. But in chronic itch, it becomes a machine that repeatedly reopens the very barrier it's supposed to protect. Return to the first fingernail, hovering above the irritated spot. From outside, the next motion might seem childish, weak, or irrational. From within, it's the end of a chain that started before language, before shame, before the neat moral story of restraint. Shame describes only the outside view, not the internal command. The wound doesn't argue. The broken skin won't be convinced by guilt. Inflammation doesn't wait for a better explanation before signaling again. So the answer isn't that the scratcher wants damage. The answer is colder. This machinery predates the explanations we tell ourselves after the fact.